Los Angeles was its usual self that Friday evening, buzzing with life, the scent of street food mixing with the exhaust fumes of countless cars and the hum of conversations rising above the constant motion of the city. The metro rail, packed with commuters heading home or out for the night, was no different. Among the crowd stood Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump. She had just wrapped up a high-profile event in downtown LA and, rather than calling for a motorcade, had opted to take the metro, blending in with everyday citizens. Dressed in a smart navy blue blazer over a white blouse, her blonde hair neatly tucked behind her ears, Karoline carried herself with the calm composure that had become her trademark in the press briefing room. She held a leather-bound notebook in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, minding her own business as the train sped through the underground tunnels of the city. A few seats away, a young man in his late 20s spotted her. His dark eyes widened as he recognized her from the news. With an overgrown beard and a hoodie that read, "Make Empathy Great Again," he smirked and nudged his friend beside him. "Dude, look who it is," he whispered, loud enough for others nearby to hear. Miss Propaganda herself. Karoline Leavitt, Trump's mouthpiece. His friend, a slightly older man in a beanie, chuckled. "What's she doing on the metro? Thought she only rode in armored limos with tinted windows." Karoline remained focused on her notebook, jotting down thoughts for the next press briefing. But she could sense the stares, the whispers growing louder. She had dealt with this before. Public figures, especially those associated with politics, were often confronted in unexpected places. The young man in the hoodie took it a step further, standing up and clearing his throat dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are graced with the presence of none other than Karoline Leavitt, the esteemed press secretary for the Donald himself." He clapped his hands sarcastically, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. A few heads turned, some out of curiosity, others out of concern. Karoline sighed but didn't react, at least not yet. "You know," the man continued, "I gotta ask, Miss Leavitt, how does it feel to work for a guy who thinks climate change is a hoax and tweets more than a teenage influencer?" His voice dripped with mockery. The train rumbled forward, stopping at the next station, allowing a few passengers to shuffle in and out. But Karoline remained silent, sipping her coffee with deliberate patience. Encouraged by her lack of response, the man smirked and pressed on. "I mean, really, do you guys get training on how to dodge questions? Or is it just a natural talent you develop in the White House?" His friend snickered and a few others around them chuckled nervously. Some commuters looked uncomfortable while others watched intently, waiting to see what would happen next. Karoline finally looked up, her blue eyes locking onto his with an expression that was both calm and calculating. She had spent years handling aggressive reporters in the briefing room. This was nothing new. But she knew better than to engage without a plan. She closed her notebook, adjusted her posture, and, for the first time, spoke. "You seem to have a lot to say," she said smoothly. "Tell me, what's your name?" The man hesitated for a moment, not expecting her to engage so directly. Jake." "Well, Jake," she continued, her voice unwavering, "you seem very passionate about politics. Do you follow the press briefings regularly?" Jake scoffed. "Only when I need a good laugh." Karoline nodded. "That's good. It means you're engaged. But I'm curious, since you seem to think I'm so bad at my job, can you tell me which policy of this administration you disagree with the most?" Jake blinked. He had expected her to either ignore him or get defensive. Instead, she had turned the tables. The train continued its journey, the eyes of the passengers bouncing between the two like spectators at a tennis match. "Well," Jake started, trying to regain his footing. "For starters, your boss keeps lying about the economy. He keeps saying it's booming, but for who? Rich people? The rest of us are struggling." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "The economy. That's a good place to start. Tell me, Jake, do you know the current unemployment rate?" Jake hesitated. No. But I know people are struggling." Karoline smiled knowingly. "That's fair. But if we're going to have an honest discussion, we should at least deal with facts. The unemployment rate right now is the lowest it's been in over a decade. That's not just me saying it, that's data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics." Jake shifted uncomfortably, but Karoline wasn't done. "And as for struggling Americans, do you know how many jobs have been added in the past year?" Jake looked away, muttering something under his breath. "I'll help you out," Karoline continued. "Over 3 million jobs. And wages? They've been rising too. Again, these aren't just talking points, these are numbers you can look up." The metro car had gone quieter now, passengers listening intently as Karoline calmly dismantled Jake's assumptions. But Jake wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "You can throw out all the numbers you want, but it doesn't change the fact that your administration is full of liars. You guys spin everything to make Trump look good. Karoline chuckled softly, shaking her head. Jake, I think you misunderstand something. My job isn't to spin, it's to communicate facts. Now, if you don't like those facts, that's fine. But let's not pretend they don't exist. The train began slowing down again. Jake swallowed hard, his smirk faltering. He hadn't expected Karoline to fire back with facts. He thought she'd get flustered, maybe even storm off in frustration. But instead, she sat there, composed, waiting for his next move like a chess grandmaster who already knew the outcome of the game. The metro doors slid open, and a few passengers stepped off while others boarded. One man in a business suit took a seat nearby, looking intrigued. An elderly woman across from them adjusted her glasses, her eyes darting between Karoline and Jake like she was watching a live debate show. Jake ran a hand through his scruffy beard, searching for something, anything, that would give him the upper hand again. All right, he said, forcing a chuckle. You want to talk numbers? Fine. Let's talk about healthcare. Your administration keeps trying to gut affordable healthcare. Millions of Americans depend on it, and you guys don't care. Karoline raised an eyebrow. You're talking about the Affordable Care Act, right? Jake nodded confidently. Yeah, Obamacare. You guys have been trying to tear it apart since day one. Karoline sighed, placing her notebook on her lap. Jake, tell me, do you know how many insurance providers pulled out of the ACA marketplaces because they were losing money? Jake blinked. What does that have to do with? Just humor me, Karoline interjected, her voice as smooth as ever. Jake hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Over 80, she answered. And do you know why? Because the ACA was failing to keep premiums affordable. Many people found themselves stuck in a system where their monthly costs skyrocketed, and their choices shrank. What the Trump administration did was introduce policies that gave people more options, including short-term health plans that were more affordable for many families. Jake scoffed. Yeah, right. You mean junk insurance. Plans that don't cover real healthcare costs. Karoline smiled. That's an oversimplification. Those plans work for a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford anything at all. And let's not forget something important. When we removed the individual mandate penalty, we stopped forcing people to buy a product they didn't want. Isn't that what freedom is about? Letting people choose? Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around as if hoping someone else would jump in and back him up. But instead, all he got was silence. A few passengers had pulled out their phones, whether to record the exchange or fact-check her claims, he wasn't sure. Karoline took a sip of her coffee as if she hadn't just outmaneuvered him in front of a captive audience. Look, Jake, she said, her tone softening, I get that you don't like this administration. That's fine. Dissent is part of democracy. But if you're going to challenge me, at least come prepared with facts, not just slogans. Jake's face turned red. Oh, come on, he muttered. This is what you do, right? You deflect. You twist things. Karoline sighed. Jake, if I were twisting things, someone on this train would have called me out by now. She glanced at the business-suited man nearby. Sir, you've been listening? Have I said anything inaccurate? The man, who had been quietly observing, smiled. Not that I've heard. Actually, I was just thinking that you should consider running for office. A small ripple of laughter spread through the train car. Even the elderly woman across from them grinned. Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being on the losing end of an argument, especially not one he had started. Karoline, sensing that she had made her point, leaned back in her seat. Look, Jake, we might not agree on everything, and that's okay. But if you want to change things, don't just heckle people on the train. Get involved. Run for office. Volunteer. Debate with facts, not just feelings. Jake stared at her for a moment, then looked away, arms crossed. He had no comeback. The metro pulled into another station and the doors slid open once more. A few people got up, giving Karoline a subtle nod of respect as they exited. The young man in the beanie, who had been laughing along earlier, patted Jake on the shoulder. Dude, he muttered, shaking his head. She wrecked you. Jake sighed. He had come looking for an easy win, but instead he had been given a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The metro train continued its steady journey through Los Angeles, but the energy inside the car had shifted. What had started as a casual act of public humiliation aimed at Karoline Leavitt had turned into something else entirely. People were no longer smirking at her, they were intrigued, some even impressed. Jake, still slouched in his seat, tried to process what had just happened. He wasn't used to losing arguments, especially in public. Normally, when he confronted people like Karoline, conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters, they would either dodge, get defensive, or lash out. But Karoline had done none of that. She had stood her ground, stayed calm, and most frustratingly, she had made sense. The man in the business suit who had earlier suggested Karoline run for office leaned forward. "You know, I don't agree with everything the Trump administration has done," he said, "but I have to admit she's got a point." People throw around a lot of accusations without actually looking at the facts. Karoline gave him a polite nod. "That's all I ask. People don't have to agree with me, but at least let's have an informed debate." The elderly woman across from them chuckled. "Honey, you just took that boy to school." A few chuckles rippled through the train car. Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Whatever," he muttered. "It's easy to throw numbers around, but they don't tell the whole story." Karoline glanced at him thoughtfully. "Okay, then let's talk about stories. Since numbers aren't enough, tell me, how has this administration personally affected you?" Jake hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean, tell me your story," Karoline said. "You seem passionate about politics. What's your personal stake in all this?" Jake fidgeted with his hoodie sleeve. For the first time, he looked less like an aggressive heckler and more like someone with a burden he hadn't voiced before. "My mom," he finally said. "She was a teacher for 25 years. Then she got sick cancer. And we struggled like hell to afford her treatment. The insurance company kept finding ways to deny coverage. And the government didn't do a damn thing to help." Karoline's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jake." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, well, sorry doesn't pay hospital bills." The train rumbled on, the silence stretching between them. After a moment, Karoline spoke again. "I hear you. The healthcare system is broken in many ways. No administration, Republican or Democrat, has fully fixed it. But I promise you, we're trying." Jake shook his head. "Trying? By slashing healthcare programs?" Karoline sighed. "By making reforms that help people get better care, not just expensive coverage that doesn't actually work. The Trump administration pushed for price transparency so hospitals couldn't blindside patients with massive bills. We fought to lower prescription drug prices. We gave states more control to design healthcare plans that actually fit their residents' needs." Jake looked up, skeptical but listening. Karoline continued, "And as for insurance companies playing games, that's a bipartisan problem. Both parties have allowed them to get away with it for years. I'm not saying we've solved it overnight, but we're not ignoring it either." Jake exhaled sharply, staring at the floor. He didn't want to admit it, but she wasn't just spewing talking points. She was engaging with him, really engaging. "Look," Karoline said, "your mom's situation is heartbreaking. No one should have to go through that. But blaming only one side won't fix the problem. If you really care about this issue, why not work on changing it instead of just venting on a train?" Jake's eyes flickered with something, anger, maybe, but also recognition. She wasn't mocking him. She was challenging him to step up. The metro slowed down as it approached another station. The doors slid open and more people trickled in, filling the car. Among them was a man in a dark blue suit with neatly combed gray hair. He glanced around the train car before his gaze landed on Karoline. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. Karoline noticed him too. And for the first time since this whole exchange had started, she looked genuinely surprised. "Miss Leavitt," the man said, stepping closer. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Jake watched as Karoline's posture shifted just slightly, not defensive, but alert. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another commuter. Karoline straightened in her seat. "Congressman Reed." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "A congressman? On the metro?" Congressman Daniel Reed, a well-known Democratic representative from California, gave her a polite smile. "I assume you're in town for official business?" Karoline nodded. "Something like that. And you?" Reed chuckled. "I actually take the metro often. Helps me stay connected to the people I serve." He glanced at Jake. "Looks like you've been having an interesting conversation." Jake, still processing everything, hesitated. Yeah, you could say that." Reed turned back to Karoline. "Mind if I sit?" Karoline gestured to the open seat across from her. "Be my guest." As the congressman sat down, Jake felt his pulse quicken. He had started this ride thinking he was just going to roast a Trump official in public. Now he was sitting in a train car with a White House press secretary and a U.S. congressman. And from the look on Karoline's face, this conversation was far from over. Jake shifted in his seat, feeling like he had stepped into a political debate far above his pay grade. He had started off mocking Karoline, but now he found himself caught between two high-profile political figures. Congressman Daniel Reed adjusted his tie and looked between Jake and Karoline, his expression thoughtful. So, what exactly were you two debating before I got here? Karoline smiled slightly. Oh, Jake here was just giving me a hard time about healthcare, among other things. Reed's gaze turned to Jake, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. That's so? Jake swallowed. He wasn't sure if he had the energy to go another round, especially now that an actual congressman was involved. Yeah, I was just saying how the Trump administration is making things worse for working-class Americans. Reed nodded slowly. And Karoline? She's defending the administration, obviously, Jake muttered. Reed turned back to Karoline. Mind if I step in? Karoline raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to go ahead. Be my guest. The congressman clasped his hands together. Jake, I understand your frustration. I really do. A lot of people feel like the government isn't working for them, no matter which party is in charge. And truthfully, Washington does have a lot of problems. Jake nodded quickly. Exactly. Reed continued, but let me ask you something, what do you do to fix it? Jake blinked. Ha! I mean, besides getting angry on public transportation, Reed said with a small smile. Are you politically active? Do you vote in primaries? Do you volunteer for causes you care about? Jake hesitated. I mean, I vote in the big elections. Reed nodded. That's a start. But here's the problem, most real decisions happen before the general election. Primaries, city council races, school boards, those are the places where policies get shaped. Most people don't pay attention until it's too late. Jake exhaled. So what, you're saying this is my fault? Reed shook his head. I'm saying if you really care about these issues, don't just complain to get involved. Go to town halls, push for better policies, support candidates who align with your values. Sitting on a train and yelling at Karoline Leavitt won't change anything. Jake sat back, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so much time being angry at the system that he had never thought about what he could do to change it. Karoline smirked. You know, Jake, I never thought I'd say this, but the congressman actually made my argument for me. Reed chuckled. Don't get used to it. The train slowed as it approached another station. The PA system announced the next stop and Reed stood up. Well, this is my stop, he said. It was nice meeting you, Karoline. And Jake, think about what I said. Jake gave a small nod as the congressman stepped off the train. The doors slid shut and the metro continued its journey. The tension had eased, but Jake felt like something had shifted inside him. He had started this ride thinking he had all the answers, but now he wasn't so sure. Karoline picked up her coffee and took a sip. So, Jake, she said, what's your next move? Jake exhaled. I don't know. Maybe I'll start paying more attention to local elections. Karoline smiled. That's a good start. The train rolled on, and for the first time that day, Jake wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for answers. Jake leaned back against his seat, staring at the floor of the metro. The noise of the train, the faint chatter of other passengers, and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks all faded into the background. His mind was still processing everything that had happened in the past few minutes. He had stepped onto this train ready to humiliate Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary. He had seen her as just another face of an administration he despised. But instead of a shouting match or a defensive retreat, she had stood firm, challenged him, and, most annoyingly, made him think. And then there was Congressman Reed, who had thrown an entirely new challenge at him. He had never considered that he might have a role to play in fixing the system he was so angry about. Karoline's voice broke through his thoughts. You're thinking about what the congressman said, aren't you? Jake exhaled. Yeah, I guess I am. She smiled, taking another sip of her coffee. Good. More people should. Jake let out a half laugh, shaking his head. I still don't like your boss, though. Karoline chuckled. I didn't expect to change your mind about that. The metro rolled into another station, and a new wave of passengers entered the train. Among them was a young woman in her 20s, wearing a tattered hoodie and holding a sign that read, "Homeless, please help." She moved through the train car quietly, holding out a cup. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others fished into their pockets for spare change. Jake sighed. This is what I mean. We live in the richest country in the world, and people still live like this. Karoline followed his gaze, her expression softening. It's heartbreaking, no doubt. Jake turned to her, his frustration resurfacing. And yet, your side keeps saying we can't afford to help them. Karoline met his eyes. That's not true, Jake. The question isn't if we should help. It's how we help. The government can throw money at problems, but if that money isn't used effectively, it won't change anything. Jake scoffed. And what, you think tax cuts for billionaires are the solution? Karoline sighed. I think the solution is smarter policies. We need to empower people, not just make them dependent on government aid. We need better mental health resources, more job training programs, and policies that make it easier for businesses to hire and pay workers well. Jake rubbed his forehead. You really believe all that, don't you? Karoline smiled. I wouldn't be doing this job if I didn't. Jake looked at the homeless woman again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few dollars, dropping them into her cup. She gave him a tired but grateful nod before moving on. Karoline watched him. That was kind of you. Jake shrugged. Yeah, well, it's not enough. No, Karoline agreed. But it's a start. The metro continued its journey, but something had changed between them. The hostility was gone. The debate had given way to something else, mutual respect, perhaps. As the train approached Jake's stop, he stood up, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Well, I guess this is my stop. Karoline nodded. It was nice talking, Jake. Jake smirked. Yeah, you too, I guess. He hesitated, then added, you know, you're not as bad as I thought. Karoline grinned. I'll take that as a win. With that, Jake stepped off the train, disappearing into the bustling platform. Karoline watched him go, sipping her coffee. She had faced hecklers before, but this one was different. Because for once, she had left someone not just speechless, but thinking. As the metro doors slid shut and the train pulled away, Karoline glanced out the window, a small smile playing on her lips. Some battles weren't about winning or losing. Some were about planting seeds. And today she had planted one.